Israel and Gaza marking 1,000 days since war started following a Hamas attack on the 7th of October 2023. The situation remains volatile despite a US-brokered ceasefire last October. Gaza's health ministry reporting more than 1,000 Palestinians killed since the truce late last year as of Tuesday, with Israel maintaining it is targeting Hamas and other militants, despite UN-related reports alleging genocide as well as a deliberate targeting of children. Israel has denied those accusations. A humanitarian crisis also deepening for some 2 million people in Gaza. More than 90% have been displaced, forced to stay in makeshift refugee camps. Infrastructure devastated across much of Gaza. Aid groups say promises of medicine and fuel under the truce have yet to be met. Negotiations to enforce the US-brokered ceasefire stalling as well. The issue of Hamas disarming proving to be the biggest sticking point and posing a major test to US President Donald Trump's Board of Peace. That body set up to oversee post-war recovery, meeting earlier this week to finalize potential measures. In Israel, protests across Jerusalem, including outside the Knesset, to mark 1,000 days since the Hamas attack in 2023. They're demanding an independent state inquiry on security failures that led to this incident. 3 years on, multiple fronts of fighting opening up in the Middle East. That includes the war on Iran and widening Israeli clashes in Lebanon with Iran-backed Hezbollah. And we're joined by Dr. Clemens Chay, Senior Fellow for Geopolitics at the Observer Research Foundation, Middle East. He speaks to us from Dubai. Thanks for joining us this evening, Dr. Chay. So we just heard about what's happening in Gaza. So fighting Hamas there, or rather Hamas is the issue there, disarming Hamas. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, with regard to settling a wider peace in Iran, addressing Hezbollah in Lebanon. So multiple theatres of conflict. Are we looking at a period, certainly in the Middle East, where a ceasefire is no longer a full cessation of fire?
Well, firstly, good to be with you. And I think this brings us to a very important question on what a ceasefire means. And I think so far what we have seen in various conflict theaters is that, ceasefire is not exactly the cessation of hostilities. We still see some low-intensity conflict going on. And really, I think this is best put in the term violent peace. And of course, the Trump administration's Board of Peace, which was meant to resolve conflicts outside the UN traditional mandate and also bypassing various multilateral frameworks because it views as too slow. I think that hasn't shown to be effective at the moment. And I think if you look at various conflicts, even beyond the Middle East, that logic of the Board of Peace has been tested and has had limited success. Russia has not yielded to any peace deal. Gaza, of course, which was showcased earlier, remains in violence as well and complicated in violence as well. And of course, the biggest stories of the days and months is Iran. And Iran has also been resisting all kinds of mounting pressures and threats.
So, Dr. Chay, when we hear progress being hailed at the latest round of indirect talks in Qatar, that's progress relative to what?
Well, progress is really relative to the tit-for-tat strikes between the US and Iran over the Strait of Hormuz that we saw last weekend, and the positive progress that has been lauded by mediators, Qataris and the Pakistanis, really encapsulates the fact that, the talks have not collapsed. The MOU is still being discussed. And that's really what they are referring to by progress. But really, right now, the real story is that we are approximately 2 weeks since the Islamabad MOU was signed, digitally or otherwise. And yet, the central focus of these Doha talks that we just saw is still on the strait, the waterway whose status is still supposedly being settled in the MOU, but still being contested at the moment. So I think positive progress with definitely a lot of limits there.
All right. I think you along with many. In fact, our correspondent just pointed out that for Iran, what's happening in Strait of Hormuz, that is a point of leverage. There's no reason at all for Iran to yield concretely on the strait.
Well, that comes back to the MOU that was being signed between the US and Iran, and the architecture of that MOU really calls for the best efforts to ensure the safe passage of commercial vessels for 60 days. And yet, we are still seeing the strikes, from both sides last weekend. And I think Iran, has the leverage because of how this MOU has been structured. And this is not a coincidence. Obviously, Iran doesn't want to lose its trump card over the strait, but also the sequencing of the MOU fundamentally advantages Iran because it says that, there should be economic concessions coming in first for Tehran, including frozen assets being released, and that $6 billion of frozen assets were discussed in Doha before, any other more difficult talks with regards to the nuclear file, with regards to the proxies of Iran can be further negotiated. So I think this MOU architecture certainly advantages Iran, but that doesn't, of course, take away that leverage that Iran has over the Strait of Hormuz.
Arguably, of course, from the US point of view, they could say we can ease up on sanctions, we can ease up on frozen funds. In return, we can make some progress towards what for certainly Donald Trump is the key issue, which is, of course, Iran's nuclear program.
Yes, that's right. I mean, of course, the US-Israel military campaign that was launched on February 28 was, the raison d'etre of this campaign was the nuclear program, but also Iran's ballistic missile program, and both of which have not been resolved. And I think these will take some time beyond the 60-day window that the MOU prescribes. But the more important thing is that the Strait of Hormuz has become a pressure point for the global economy, as many economists and analysts have covered. And the fact that it can, having the control over the strait also means that you have control over the global energy markets. And that also feeds into Washington's domestic political calculus, and the fuel prices in the US and inflationary pressures. And that means that Washington is not exempted from being held hostage through this choke point that Iran has. And this is a choke point that bombs themselves cannot simply reopen, as we have seen for the past few months. Iran still can actively open and close the Strait of Hormuz. So the strategic reality, I think, is pretty simple, is that, as long as the strait remains unresolved, Iran retains that leverage. And if we talk about, the concessions that are at play, including the frozen assets and all, I think these carrots, so to speak, the concessions, will continue to be dangled by the US. Already we have seen sanctions waiver for Iranian oil exports, but we will expect to see more to get more trade-offs, but also to retain Iran at the negotiating table.
Our final question, Dr. Chay. The US can afford to bargain and dangle carrots, but the pressure point, or the countries that are really being held hostage, would be the Gulf states. It's not just economically a pressure point for them, it's also a huge security threat given where they are geographically. Final question.
Yes, that's right. I think the Gulf states, which are Iran's neighbors, are navigating two very distinct but also overlapping concerns. And I think, of course, the immediate one being Hormuz. If you look at the Gulf states' own infrastructure, energy infrastructure in particular, I think the bypass routes and alternative energy routes besides Hormuz really are kept within the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But besides these two Gulf states, I think the defining issue of Hormuz feeds into the worries of other Gulf states such as Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and so on. And they have no maritime alternative. At one point, Kuwait reported no oil export. I believe that was in April 2026, and they cannot simply pipe around the strait for LNG and oil exports. So that's the first part of it, and that will be something to be resolved in the immediate term. And we've seen, of course, CENTCOM organizing. The US CENTCOM organizing a 12-nation regional security dialogue just yesterday, very likely to discuss how best to proceed with addressing the Strait of Hormuz issue. But the longer-term challenge for the Gulf states is much more structural. If and when the US withdraws its forces from the region, including the Armada that Trump proudly claimed in the early months of 2026, when that happens, I think Iran is here to stay in the region. And the Gulf states know that. And I think that demonstrates that even the whole episode so far demonstrates that a degraded Iran still retains asymmetric capability, low-cost measures to disrupt the strait, but also to threaten Gulf infrastructure, disrupt air corridors, and of course, most of all, as I've said earlier, open and closing the Strait of Hormuz at will. And I think the answers, are still being up in the air.
All right, very much up in the air. Thanks for that, Dr. Clemens Chay, Senior Fellow for Geopolitics at Observer Research Foundation, Middle East. Thank you for joining us.